Sir Latham Pemberton closed his eyes. He opened them. "Her Grace," he said, "the Duchess of Stormhaven." The dining room of White's exhaled. 40 men of consequence in the city, who had not spoken for the past 9 minutes, because the Duke of Stormhaven had been speaking, exhaled quietly, and at the same instant, and the sound of it was the small, audible sound of a city tilting on the spot. The Duke had counted the days that brought him to that sentence. 317 of them. He had counted them in his own hand, in the locked drawer of his desk. Every morning, since the woman now standing in the doorway behind him had walked into his library with 500 sovereigns in her gloved hand and given them back, he had not known, 317 mornings ago, that he was counting toward a sentence in the dining room of White's. He had only known that he was counting. The arrival point had been her arrival. He did not turn his head to look at her. He did not have to. He had felt the door of the small parlour open behind him before he had heard it, and he had spoken his last sentence to Sir Latham in the certainty that the door would open at the precise instant he required it to. The household at Stormhaven House had not failed him in 3 years. The household had not failed him tonight. The woman in the doorway did not move. She had not been told she was the Duchess of Stormhaven. She had not been asked. She had given no answer to any question this man had put to her in any room. In 3 weeks, she looked at Sir Latham. She did not look at the Duke. This is the Governess Hour. How many times would you walk past a fortune you could keep before someone began to notice? How long could a woman remain invisible in a house that had decided to forget her name? And what happens when the man who finally sees her is the one man in England with both the means and the patience to make every single person who looked through her remember exactly what they did? Welcome back to the Governess Hour, where the Women's Society discards become the ones the most powerful men in England cannot live without. Before we begin, drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing this community span the globe. Tonight's story is about a woman who held 500 sovereigns in her hand and gave them back. 500 sovereigns in a city where she had 6 shillings to her name, no family, no reference if her employer chose to dismiss her. She gave them back, and by giving them back, she set in motion something she could not possibly have anticipated. The man who lost the purse had carried it because he paid his debts in person. After Hester Marlow stood in his hall and refused the smaller life she could have had, he became a man who carried his obligations to her. The dining room of White's was the arrival point. To stand in that doorway, in a borrowed black gown that did not fit her at the shoulders, to be looked at by 40 men of consequence in the city, while a baronet who had used her for 18 months was forced to address her as Her Grace. Hester Marlow had first to walk past a wall in Mayfair on a Tuesday morning in March and bend and pick up a purse. The story begins on that Tuesday. It ends in a codicil to a will written 61 years later. The parts of it that mattered most had been preparing themselves for months before, either in the schoolroom on Wimpole Street, where the woman at the centre of this story had learned to take up no space. Hester Marlow rose at 5. She had risen at 5 for 18 months, in a house where the family did not stir before 9. And she had learned in those 18 months that the silence of a house before dawn was the closest thing to a private room she would ever have. The schoolroom on the 3rd floor of the Pemberton house in Wimpole Street looked east. By 5:30, the windows were grey, and by 6 there was enough light to read by if she stood close to the glass and held the book at the right angle. She did not light the candles. Candles were a household expense, and Sir Latham Pemberton had been clear, in writing, on the matter of candles in the governess's schoolroom. He had been clear in writing. On a great many matters, she read for an hour. She read because if she did not read in the dark hours of the morning, she would not read at all, and she had decided some time ago that the day she stopped reading was the day she would let the Pemberton house finish what it had begun. By 7 she had washed and dressed. The single grey gown she had brought with her from her last position had been turned twice, and the cuffs let down once, and it would not survive another season. She had no money to replace it. She had not had money to replace it since the autumn of the previous year, when Sir Latham had explained, in the same room and with the same calm patience he might have used to refuse a tradesman, that the household had decided to pay her wages quarterly rather than monthly, and that this quarter's payment would be deferred until economies in the household had been completed. The quarter had ended in November. It was now March. No quarter's wages had arrived in any of the intervening months. She had asked once in December, after the New Year accounts were rendered. Sir Latham had looked at her over the top of his ledger and said, very pleasantly, that she was welcome to seek another situation if she found her present terms inadequate. He had then asked her, in the same pleasant voice, whether she imagined a governess dismissed without reference would find herself another situation in London or anywhere else, and how she imagined she would survive in the meantime. She had not asked again. By 7:30 she was in the schoolroom with her single pupil. Petra Pemberton was 7 years old, and she was the second of 2 children. Her brother Walter had been sent to school the previous autumn, which had reduced Hester's value in the household to the management of a small girl who already knew her letters and her sums, and required, in truth, nothing from Hester that the nursemaid below stairs could not have provided. Hester was kept on because dismissing her would have required either references or an explanation, and Sir Latham preferred the present arrangement, in which she taught Petra in the morning, mended Lady Pemberton's linen in the afternoon, and was charged in the evening with any task the household had not assigned to one of the maids. She taught Petra French verbs until 10. The child loved her in the way small children love the women who give them their full attention, and Hester loved her back, in the way women in her position learned not to admit, because attachment to a child not your own was a weakness, and the household had taught her every variety of weakness she could afford to carry. At 10 she took Petra to the nursery and surrendered her to Nan, who would walk her to the park. At 10:15 she was called to the library. Sir Latham Pemberton was a man of medium height and medium build who had been a baronet for 11 years, owned a townhouse in Wimpole Street and a smaller estate in Buckinghamshire, kept his accounts personally, and was rumoured, in the small clubs in which he was permitted membership, to have spent the last 3 years quietly outrunning his creditors. None of this was visible in his manner. His manner was pleasant. The pleasantness was the worst of it. "Miss Marlow," he said when she came in. "Sit down." She did not sit. The chair he had gestured to was the one nearest the window, and she had learned in the 18 months that sitting in the chairs Sir Latham offered her in his library was the first small surrender in a series of small surrenders, and that he counted the surrenders. "I prefer to stand, Sir Latham. I have my pupil's work to attend to before luncheon. Petra is in the park. Walter's holiday work, then. He returns in 3 weeks. I have promised to have his Greek prepared." He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. He was very good at looking at her for a moment longer than the conversation required, and very good at the small smile that went with it. He was good, in general, at the parts of cruelty that did not require effort. "I have an errand for you," he said. "My stationer in Bond Street has prepared an order. The boy is ill. The footman is in livery. For the afternoon callers, the second girl has gone to her mother in Highgate. There is no one to send. The order has been waiting a week. I should like you to walk out and collect it. Bring the bill back directly. I shall require the receipt for my accounts. Sir Latham? Yes, it is some distance. It is some distance. You will find the walk salutary." She did not say what she might have said. She had learned not to. She inclined her head, the small inclination that took less of her than a curtsy, and was still permitted in a governess's exchange with her employer, and she went up to her room to fetch her bonnet. Now I want to pause here, because if you have not spent time inside the small literature of the Victorian governess, you may not understand what was actually happening in that library. A governess in 1854 England occupied a position. The law had not invented words, for she was not a servant. The servants ate together, slept in a common attic, knew the security of fixed wages and a recognized place in the household. She was not a member of the family. The family ate in the dining room, slept in the bedrooms, owned the rooms she taught in. She existed in between, and the in-between was a space the law and the society had agreed not to look at directly. She earned, in a respectable household, between £20 and £40 a year. From those wages she paid for her own clothing, her own books, her own postage, her own laundry, above what the household provided, and any small object she might need across the long stretches of the year. Her contract could be terminated by her employer at any time, for any reason or for none, and the only thing that stood between her and complete destitution was a letter of reference from that same employer. Without the letter she could not be hired. Without hire she could not eat. The letter was not a courtesy. The letter was her survival. Sir Latham Pemberton, in the autumn of 1853, had quietly understood all of this, and he had begun, in small ways, and then in larger ones, to remind Hester Marlow of it, which is why, on the Tuesday morning in March that begins this story, when Sir Latham sent her to walk 1.5 miles across London on foot to fetch a parcel a hackney could have delivered for 2 shillings, Hester Marlow did not say what any free woman in that situation might have said. She put on her bonnet and she walked. It was a grey morning. The fog had not lifted off the streets, and the cabmen were charging extra to navigate it, which was the reason Sir Latham had sent her on foot, rather than ordering a hackney for an errand of this length. She had no objection to the walk. Walking was the only time of the day that did not belong to anyone, and she stretched the route through Mayfair when she could, in the small hope that she might pass a window with a book in it, or a square where a row of plane trees met above her head. She collected the order at the stationer's. Sir Latham had ordered a leather-bound ledger, 2 reams of writing paper, a quire of pen nibs, and a stick black sealing wax. The package was wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, tied in twine, and given to her with the bill, which she had been instructed to take directly back to the house for Sir Latham's review. She left Bond Street and turned north. She had been told to come straight home. She did not come straight home. She turned instead into the long quiet of Brook Street, and from Brook Street into Grosvenor Square, and from the square into one of the smaller streets that ran behind the great houses there, because she had not been into Mayfair in 3 weeks. And she wanted to look at it for as long as the package in her arms would permit before she returned to the schoolroom and the silence and the day that would not end until 10. It was in the small street behind the great houses, by a side gate set into a high wall, that she saw the purse. It was lying in the mud at the base of the wall. Brown leather, drawn tight at the neck, with a leather cord, the cord half undone. The shape of it was wrong for an object that had been dropped on purpose. The weight of it, when she bent and lifted it, was wrong for any object she had handled in 3 years. She stood in the small street with the purse in her hands and her package against her hip, and she did not move. Across the street a maid was beating a rug against the railing of an area gate. Down the street a coal cart rattled past. No one was looking at her. No one had seen her bend. She could put the purse into the basket at the bottom of her parcel, walk back to Wimpole Street with it under the oilcloth and the writing paper, take it up to the schoolroom, hide it in the locked drawer of her own desk before Sir Latham asked to see the bill, and have, by midnight, more money than she had ever held in her life. She knew before she opened the purse that there was a great deal of money in it. She opened the purse. She counted with her gloved hand half inside it, so that the rest of the street could not see, 20 piles of 25 sovereigns, £500 in coin. The number sat in her chest and did not move. £500 was a sum a governess in her position would not see again. She knew in the moment of opening the purse what £500 could buy. It could buy her passage to anywhere she chose. It could buy 3 years of modest lodgings in a quiet town. It could buy the small house her aunt had once written letters from, the years before her aunt had died, and the rest of the family with her. It could buy her the silence she had spent 3 years dreaming of in the schoolroom on the 3rd floor. She closed the purse. She tightened the cord. She did not move for what felt like a long time, although the maid across the street was still beating the same rug when she finally drew a slow breath and looked up at the gate beside her. And here I want to pause again, because the modern listener may have heard £500 and registered a sum of money without registering what £500 actually meant in 1854. A governess earned, as I have said, £20 to £40 a year. A skilled tradesman earned perhaps 80. A respectable London clerk earned 150. A naval surgeon earned 200. A country curate, if he was fortunate, 300. The sum in Hester's hands, in coin, in mud, in the back street of Mayfair, was 8 to 25 years of her own wages. It was more than she would earn in any version of her life. It was the difference between every constrained future she could imagine and any free one, and she stood with it in her gloved hand, and she made the choice that defines this story. The gate beside her was set into a wall taller than she was. A small brass plate bore the number 12. She had walked past number 12 in this same street perhaps a dozen times in 18 months, and she had not until that morning noticed it. She did not know whose house it was. She did know that the purse had been dropped close enough to the gate, that the chance of it, belonging to whoever lived behind the wall, was high. She walked the length of the small street to the corner. She walked back. She stood in front of the brass plate. She did not move for some minutes. She thought, very specifically, about her aunt's house in the country town. She thought, very specifically, about the schoolroom on the 3rd floor in Wimpole Street, and the cuffs of her grey gown, and the look on Sir Latham's face the morning he had told her about the deferred wages. She thought about the years she would not get back. She thought about her hand, which had closed around the leather cord without her telling it to, as though it had already known what she was going to do before she had known. She pulled the bell at the side of the gate. She heard footsteps on the other side of the wall. The gate opened a hand's width, and a man in a dark coat looked through it at her. He did not ask her business. He looked at her face, and then at the package in her arms, and then at the way her gloved hand was held at her side in the small careful posture of someone holding something heavier than its size. "I believe," she said, and she kept her voice in the level register of a woman in a position. "I believe this may belong to someone in this house. I found it at the foot of the wall." The man in the dark coat looked at her hand. He did not move. After a moment, he opened the gate the rest of the way. "You had better come in," he said. She did not come in. She held the purse out to him. In her gloved hand the cord still tightened. "I have an errand to complete. I cannot stay." "I am sorry," the man said, and his voice was not unkind. "You will have to. The household will need to verify the purse. We cannot accept the return of a sum of this size without a name. If you give it to me and walk away, the household will have no record of who returned it, and I will be the one to answer for it. You see the difficulty?" She did see the difficulty. She had not anticipated it. She had imagined the transaction would take a half-second at a back gate, and that she would be gone before any face had attached itself to her own. She stepped through the gate. The house behind the wall was larger than she had imagined any house could be when she had walked past it. The garden was small and severe, gravelled and lined with box hedges, and the back of the house rose 3 stories above her. The windows ranked in pale stone. The door at the top of 3 shallow steps closed and unguarded. The man in the dark coat walked half a step behind her, neither hurrying her nor slowing her, his hands at his sides. He was perhaps 50 years old. His coat was very plain and very well cut. "Through the side door," he said, not unkindly. "The front hall will not do for this conversation." He took her through a small side door into a corridor lined with prints, and from the corridor into a room she did not at first identify, because she had never been in a room like it. The walls were dark green silk. The bookshelves were ceiling high. The fire was lit. There were 3 chairs and a long writing desk, and no other person in the room, and the man in the dark coat indicated the chair nearest the fire and said, "Sit down, please. His Grace will be down directly." She did not sit down. She stood with the purse in her gloved hand and the package in the crook of her other arm, and her face arranged in the careful blankness she had practiced every day for 18 months, and she said, "His Grace." "Yes, whose house is this?" The man in the dark coat looked at her with the smallest fraction of warmth that any servant of a great house had ever shown her, and he said, "You are in the London residence of His Grace Magnus Hartstone, the Duke of Stormhaven. I am Hadley, his man. Please sit down. The Duke does not like to keep women standing." She had heard the Duke's name in the way governesses heard the names of dukes, which is to say that she had read it in the newspapers, when the newspapers reached the schoolroom 3 days late, and that she had once heard it spoken at a Pemberton dinner by a guest who had said, with the small reverence Englishmen reserved for very large fortunes, that Stormhaven kept 40,000 a year, and could buy a small country if the small country were for sale. She had not connected the name to a wall in a street she walked past in the mornings. She had not connected anything to the wall in a street she walked past in the mornings. The wall had been a wall. She heard footsteps on the stair beyond the room. The man in the dark coat, Hadley, stepped to the door and opened it. The Duke of Stormhaven came into the room. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered, because she was not a tall woman, and she had grown accustomed to looking up at most men. But the Duke required a different angle. He was dressed in dark clothing, very plain, very expensively cut, and the manner with which he wore the clothing was the manner of a man who had not thought about it since dressing. He was perhaps 34. His hair was dark, and his face was the still careful face of a man who had spent his adult life being looked at by other people, and had decided, at some point quite early, that he would not let them see anything they had not already paid for. He looked at Hadley. Hadley nodded once and stepped back from the door. Then the Duke looked at Hester Marlow. He looked at her for some seconds. She held the purse out. She did not curtsy. She had not curtsied at the gate, and she would not begin now. The Duke's gaze moved from her face to her gloved hand to the purse in it, and back to her face and rested there. "You found it," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, and quieter. She had imagined a duke would speak. As Sir Latham spoke, with the patient pleasantness that had no warmth in it. The Duke did not speak like Sir Latham. The Duke spoke as though the cost of speaking required him to mean it. "I found it in the street behind the wall," Hester said. "At the foot of the gate I was passing. How long ago?" "Perhaps a quarter of an hour. I came directly. Did you open it?" "Yes." She said it. Before, she had calculated whether, too. She had decided, somewhere between the brass plate and the side door, that she would not lie to whoever the purse belonged to. The decision had been made without consultation with the rest of her, and the rest of her had been required to honour it. "How much?" 500 sovereigns, I counted. The Duke did not move. He did not look at the purse again. He looked at her face. After a moment he said, very quietly, "Why did you bring it back?" She did not at first know how to answer this. She had not expected the question. She had expected a coin or two for her trouble, and a closed door, and she had prepared herself to refuse the coin or two, and to walk away in the small, clean dignity of having done a thing without expectation. She had not prepared herself for the question. She looked at him. She said slowly, "I do not know how to answer that. It is not mine." He did not move. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, still very quietly, "May I see the purse?" She held it out. He took it from her gloved hand. His own hand was bare. His fingers, in the moment of the exchange, did not touch hers, but the heat of his hand passed across the small space, and she registered the heat in the same dispassionate way. She registered the colour of the silk on the walls, and she filed both away to think about later. He weighed the purse in his hand. He did not open it. He set it on the writing desk without looking at it. "Hadley," he said, 20 sovereigns to miss." He stopped. He looked at her. "I have not asked your name." "Marlow," she said. "Hester Marlow." He said her name. He said it once with his mouth without comment, as though he were testing the sound of it in a room. Then he looked back at Hadley. "No reward," Hester said. She had spoken before Hadley could begin to move. The Duke turned to her. She held his look. "I should be obliged if you would not. I did not return the purse for that." The Duke did not answer immediately. He looked at her face and at her hands and at the cuffs of her grey gown, which she had let down once and would have to let down again, and at the package in the crook of her arm. "Forgive me, Miss Marlow," he said. "I do not insult you. I only ask, are you in employment?" "I am, Your Grace, in London, in Wimpole Street." "I am the governess at Sir Latham Pemberton's." He did not move, but Hadley, behind him, did. It was the smallest movement, a slight resettling of the man's weight from one foot to the other, and Hester registered it because she had spent 18 months learning to read the small movements of men in dark coats, and she knew what such a movement meant. The man Hadley had heard the name Pemberton before. Hadley knew the name. The Duke said, after a small silence, "Then you have walked here from Wimpole Street with a parcel. I have an errand to complete on the way back." The household will be expecting me. I see. He did not move. He looked at her. She held his look. She had not curtsied, and she had refused the reward, and she was standing in the green silk library of the wealthiest duke in England, with mud on the hem of her gown, and she had decided, without making the decision, that she would not be the first to look away. He looked away first. "I shall not detain you," he said. He inclined his head. The gesture was small and very deliberate, and it was a gesture she had not received in 18 months from any man in any room. "You have done me a service, the size of which I shall not insult you by attempting to measure. Hadley will see you to the gate. I am in your debt. You are not, your grace." He looked at her again. He held the look a moment longer than the conversation required. In the manner Sir Latham held looks, and the resemblance was the resemblance of two notes played on different instruments. The notes were not the same. "Permit me," he said very quietly, "to be the judge of that." She inclined her head. She did not curtsy. Hadley moved past her to the door and opened it. She went out. She walked back through the corridor and through the side door and across the small, severe garden and out at the gate, and she did not look back at the wall. She walked the long way to Wimpole Street because she did not want to come into the house with her hands shaking, and by the time she came into the house, her hands were not shaking, but the rest of her was. She delivered the parcel to Sir Latham in his library. She handed him the bill. He looked at the bill, and then at the small clock on the mantel, and then at her, and he said, very pleasantly, "You have been a long time, Miss Marlow." "I came directly, Sir Latham. It is 1:30. The stationer's is 3/4 of an hour each way at a moderate pace. You have been gone 4 hours. I walked back through the park. I will make up the time this evening." "I am sure you will," he said. He set the bill down. He picked up his pen. "See that you do." She went out. She climbed the 3 flights to the schoolroom. She closed the door. She stood in the middle of the room for a long minute, with her hands at her sides, and she said aloud in the empty room, "I do not know what I have done." Then she sat at the small desk by the window, and she took up the Greek translation. Walter had left her to mark, and she did not let herself think about the green silk on the walls, or the Duke, or the small inclination of his head, until she had finished all 3 pages. He did not sleep that night. He stood at the window of the library, on the 1st floor of his house in Mayfair, and he looked at the street through which she had come and gone, and he thought of nothing in particular, and of her in everything in particular, and he understood, in the cold 3rd hour after midnight, that he was in trouble. He had been a man who carried his obligations personally. That was the simple fact of him. He had carried the purse because he had agreed to pay a debt to a man who would not take a banker's draft, and the man was a sergeant who had served under him at Inkerman and lost his left hand at the Alma, and refused, in the long convalescence, every offer of pension the Duke's man of business had been instructed to send, on the grounds that a sergeant did not take pensions from his colonel and would not begin now. The Duke had argued with him for the better part of a year. They had agreed, in the end, that the Duke would pay him £500 in coin, in person, in the manner of one gentleman settling a debt of honour with another, and that the sergeant would accept the coin because the form of the transaction permitted his pride to bear it. The Duke had been carrying the purse to Bermondsey on the morning Hester Marlow found it. He had dismissed his carriage at the corner of Bond Street because the morning was fine, and he had wanted to walk. He had stopped on the small street behind his house to fasten a buckle on his boot that had come loose, and he had set the purse on the wall while he fastened the buckle. and when he had walked on, he had not picked it up again. He had walked the half-mile to the cab rank before he had understood that he no longer had it. He had come back to the wall and found nothing. He had sent Hadley to ask discreetly at every house in the street whether anyone had seen a man bend at a wall that morning. Hadley had returned with nothing. The Duke had spent the 4 hours between losing the purse and seeing the woman, called Hester Marlow, walk into his green library, calculating, in the small precise way he calculated, the chance that he would ever see the £500 again. He had calculated the chance at 0. She had walked into his library with the purse in her gloved hand. She had refused the reward. She had not curtsied. He stood at the window. He thought about her face. He thought about the cuffs of her grey gown. He thought about the way she had held his look until he was the first to look away. He thought about the small precise movement Hadley had made when she had said the name Pemberton, because Hadley had served the Duke for 11 years, and Hadley did not make small movements without cause, and the Duke would ask Hadley about it in the morning. He thought about her hands, which had been visible only in the gloved one that held out the purse and the bare one that had held the package against her hip, and which were the hands of a woman who had been doing her own washing for 3 years. He thought about the address, Wimpole Street, Sir Latham Pemberton's. He did not know Sir Latham Pemberton personally. He knew the name in the way a man with 40,000 a year knew most names in the small Mayfair and Clubland circle in which his life was conducted, which was to say that he knew Pemberton owed £11,000 across 3 London houses and a Buckinghamshire mortgage, and that 2 of the 3 London houses had begun in the autumn to refuse Pemberton further credit, he thought, with the small cold patience that had won him 3 engagements in the Crimea and a number of quieter wars at home, that he would buy the debts. He thought that this was perhaps not a wise course of action, and that it would commit him to a thing he had not yet fully named, and that he would do it anyway. He went to his desk, and he wrote a letter to his man of business, and he sealed the letter, and he set it on the salver for the morning post, and he sat down at his desk, and he opened the bottom drawer, and he took out a fresh sheet of paper, and on the sheet of paper he wrote a single number. The number was the date. He locked the drawer, he went to bed at 4:15, and he did not sleep. The next morning she walked Petra to Hyde Park. She had not slept either, although she had laid the fact of not sleeping carefully aside before Petra came to the schoolroom at 9:30, because Petra was a small girl who noticed the shadows under women's eyes and asked about them. And Hester did not have the patience that morning for the question. They walked the long path under the bare plane trees, and Petra ran ahead with her hoop, and Hester walked behind her with her hands in her muff, and her face arranged for the morning, and she did not see the Duke until she had walked past him. He was standing on the gravel a little to the right of the path, with his hands behind his back, in a coat she did not recognize from the day before, and he was watching Petra. He was watching Petra. He was not watching Hester. She registered this with the small, precise interest of a woman who had spent 18 months learning to read what men were doing, and she understood in the same instant that he had positioned himself in the park so that she would see him before he had to acknowledge her, and that he had pretended to be watching the child so that Hester could choose whether to acknowledge him at all. The choice had been left to her. The courtesy of the choice was the courtesy of a man who had thought about how a woman in her position would feel about meeting him a second time, and had taken the trouble to arrange the meeting so that her feelings could decide. She slowed her step. She did not stop. He turned his head as she came level with him, as though he had only just noticed her, and he inclined his head, the small inclination, and he said, "Miss Marlow, Your Grace, a fine morning." "It is, Your Grace." She did not stop. She passed him by a half step and continued along the gravel after Petra, and she heard, a moment later, the soft crunch of his boot on the gravel behind her, and she registered that he was walking with her at a distance of perhaps 2 yards, neither beside her nor a stranger, and that he had timed the distance precisely, so that the rest of the park could not say with any certainty whether he was with her. She did not look back at him. She walked. He walked behind her. They walked in this way, the length of the long path under the bare plane trees, and at the end of the path she gathered Petra by the hand and turned for the gate, and the Duke did not follow her past the gate. When she looked back from the gate, he was standing where she had left him, his hands behind his back, his face turned to the path, and he looked, for one moment that she did not afterwards forget, the way a man looked who had just decided something difficult. She brought Petra home. She did not tell anyone where she had walked. He did not appear in the park the next day or the day after. He appeared in a bookshop in Piccadilly on the 4th day. Hester had been sent to the bookshop by Lady Pemberton, who wished a particular novel in 3 volumes that had been promised her by the proprietor, and had been delayed, and who could not be inconvenienced by sending a footman. The Duke was already in the bookshop when Hester came in. He was at a shelf at the back of the room, with a small book open in his hand, and he did not look up when the bell over the door rang. Hester saw him before he turned. She moved to the counter and inquired after Lady Pemberton's novel, and the proprietor brought the 3 volumes out, and she signed the household account, and she turned to leave. The Duke had not moved. She walked past him on the way to the door. He did not look up. At the door she stopped. She stood with her hand on the latch and her parcel against her hip, and she did not look back at him, and she said, just loudly enough for him to hear, "You are following me, Your Grace." She heard the small book close. She heard him cross the room. He stopped 2 yards behind her. He did not come closer. After a moment he said, in the same quiet voice he had used in the Green Library, "I am." She did not turn around. "I would be obliged," she said, "if you would not." He did not answer immediately. After a moment he said, "I shall not ask you for anything, Miss Marlow. I have not come into this shop to ask you for anything. I have come because I had a question about a book. I cannot prevent us from being in the same shop on the same morning. I can, if you wish, prevent us from being in the same park on the same morning. I should be obliged. Then we shall not be." She stood with her hand on the latch. She did not turn around. She thought very quickly that she had walked into something she did not understand, and that the rules of the thing were the Duke's rules, and that he was offering, in the smallest possible voice, to let her draw them. "Why?" she said. He did not answer. She turned around. He was standing where he had stopped. He had set the small book back on the shelf. His face was the still, careful face she had registered in the Green Library, and he was looking at her now, with the directness he had not permitted himself in the park. "Because," he said, "when you came into my library 4 days ago, I had not seen a woman do what you did in 11 years, and I did not know what to do with what I saw. And I have been deciding what to do with it for 4 days, and in the meantime I have been arranging for you to see me, because I did not want you to come upon me by chance, and have to wonder whether the chance was a chance. I cannot give you a better answer than that this morning, Miss Marlow. I should not in any case give you a better answer in a shop." He inclined his head. "Good morning," he said. He walked past her and out of the door and into the street. She stood by the latch with the 3 volumes against her hip, and she did not move for some seconds, and she felt, in a way she had not felt, in 18 months, the small heat of having been spoken to, as though she were a person whose opinion mattered. Then she opened the door, and she walked back to Wimpole Street, and she did not see him again for 9 days. In the 9 days, the household began to come apart. Sir Latham received a letter on the Thursday. He came into the dining room on the Friday at breakfast and did not eat, and he stood at the window with his back to the room for a long time. On the Saturday, a man Hester did not recognize called at the house and was admitted to the library, and was there for 2 hours, and left without speaking to anyone in the family. On the Sunday, Sir Latham did not go to church. On the Monday, Lady Pemberton came up to the schoolroom for the first time in 14 months, and stood in the doorway and asked Hester, in a voice she had not heard from Lady Pemberton, whether Petra had had any communication from anyone outside the household in recent weeks. Hester said no. Lady Pemberton looked at her for a moment, as though weighing whether to ask a further question, and then she nodded once and went away. On the Tuesday afternoon, Sir Latham summoned Hester to the library. She came down. She did not sit. He did not ask her to. He stood behind the desk, and he had in front of him a small stack of papers, and he looked at her in a way he had not looked at her before. The pleasantness was not in his face. The face was emptied of it. "Miss Marlow," he said, "a question. Sir Latham, you have, in the past fortnight, had occasion to be at the house of the Duke of Stormhaven." She did not move. She did not answer immediately. She had not anticipated that he would know. She had not told anyone. She had not assumed that anyone would tell him. "Yes," she said. His mouth did the small movement she had seen it do before. It did not smile. "In what capacity?" "I returned an item the Duke had lost. I was passing in the street and saw it. I did not enter the house except for the few minutes required for the Duke to verify the item. I did not accept a reward. I did not give my employer's name except when asked. When asked by whom? By the Duke, and subsequently, I beg your pardon." "You have been seen," Sir Latham said, and his voice was flat, and his eyes were on her face, walking with the Duke of Stormhaven in Hyde Park. "You have been seen speaking with him in a bookshop in Piccadilly. I am informed that the Duke's manservant has, in the past week, been to a number of houses in the neighbourhood asking after the household, and that the Duke himself has been seen in this street 3 times by my own under-coachman, who is not in the habit of imagining things. I should like an explanation, Miss Marlow." She did not move. "I do not have one to give, Sir Latham. You have not encouraged the gentleman." "I have not." "You have not received correspondence from him?" "No." "You have not met him at any private hour or in any private place?" "No." "Then," he said, "I shall require you to swear it." "Swear it?" "On the Bible." He pushed the small Bible across the desk to her. She did not pick it up. He waited. She did not pick it up. "I shall not swear," she said. "I am not in a court of law. I shall not be asked to swear in my employer's library." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed the Bible and set it back on the shelf behind the desk. And he sat down, and he said, very quietly, "Then I shall write to the Duke myself and inquire." "You will not. I beg your pardon. You will not write to the Duke," Hester said. "Because if you write to the Duke, you will be obliged to admit that you have employed me on terms that have not been paid since November, and that you have refused in writing to pay them. You will not have the Duke ask after a governess and find a baronet who has not paid her wages in 5 months. "You will not write the letter, Sir Latham." She had not planned to say it. The words had come out of her in the moment of saying them, and she could not afterwards remember the order in which she had assembled them. Only the small clean cold of having said them, and the silence in the library afterwards, and the way Sir Latham did not move for nearly a minute. "You will leave this room," he said at last. "You will go to the schoolroom. You will remain there until I send for you. You will not see Petra. You will not see Lady Pemberton. You will not leave the house. If you leave the house, I shall consider the contract terminated, and I shall write the reference you have earned. Do you understand me, Miss Marlow?" "I understand you, Sir Latham." She went out. She walked up to the schoolroom. She closed the door. She sat at the small desk by the window. She did not feel her hands until she put them flat on the desk to steady them. Then she felt them. I want to pause here, because some of you will be asking why she did not simply walk out the front door. She did not walk out the front door, because if she walked out the front door without a reference, she would not be employed in any respectable household in England again. She did not walk out because she had 6 shillings to her name. She did not walk out because in the calculus of a governess's situation in 1854, a roof and a meal and a locked schoolroom door were preferable by a wide margin to a street and a winter and a workhouse infirmary. She did not walk out because Sir Latham knew all of this and had counted on it, and Sir Latham had been counting on it for 18 months. When I was writing this scene, I had to step away from the desk for a few minutes. The smallness of the room she sat in, the way she put her hands flat on the desk to steady them. There is a particular cruelty in being trapped in a house where the locks are made of paper and ink, and I think you can feel it. Keep listening. She did not, the first night, sleep. She lay in the small bed, in the small room next to the schoolroom, and she watched the strip of corridor light under the schoolroom door, and she listened. At 1:30 she heard the feet on the stair. She knew the weight of the feet. She had heard the weight on the same house's stairs for 18 months. She had not heard it on the 3rd floor stair before. She had not heard it at this hour ever. She did not move in the bed. She had been in service long enough to know that a woman who rose in a locked room at 1:30 made the small audible noise of a woman who had been awake to hear the feet come up. She kept her hand on the small brass crucifix her aunt had given her at 12, which had stood on the table beside the bed for 18 months, and which the household had not noticed. The footsteps stopped outside the schoolroom door. She heard the key. The key turned. The schoolroom door opened. The footsteps crossed the schoolroom to the door of her own bedroom, which stood at the back of the schoolroom and which did not have a lock. He had locked the schoolroom door against the corridor, and he had counted, in the locking, on the small fact that her bedroom door had stood open to anyone who came in through the first lock. The bedroom door opened. Sir Latham stood in it. He had a candle. The candle showed his face in fragments. The fragments did not show the pleasantness she had seen for 18 months. She sat up in the bed. "Sir Latham." "Miss Marlow." He stepped 1 pace into the room. "I have come," he said, "to discuss the matter of the reference. At 1:30 in the morning. It is the hour I have decided to discuss it. You have caused me, this week, a degree of inconvenience no governess in my employ has caused me in 9 years. The matter of the reference is mine to dispose of. I have decided that I shall dispose of it at the hour of my choosing. You will hear me, Miss Marlow." She did not move from the bed. She kept her hand on the crucifix. The crucifix was small, and the bed was narrow, and her back was against the wall, and Sir Latham stood 3 feet from the bed with the candle in his hand, and a face she had not previously seen on him. "I shall hear you," she said. "The schoolroom, with the candle on the schoolroom table, and you on one side of it and I on the other. I shall not hear you in this room." He did not move. "You are not in a position to set conditions, Miss Marlow." "I am in this position. The condition is mine." He stepped closer to the bed. She did not move. She had spent 18 months learning not to move, and the lesson had not been wasted on her. She kept her hand on the crucifix. She looked at his face. She kept her voice in the register of a woman in a position who had decided, between his first step and his second, what she was prepared to do. "If you put your hand on me, Sir Latham, I shall, in the morning, walk to the corner of Wimpole Street and the New Cavendish Road, and I shall hail the first hackney, and I shall ride it to the door of the house at number 12, and I shall tell the Duke what you have done. I shall do this without a reference. I shall do this in the gown I now sleep in. I shall do this because the consequence of doing it will be smaller than the consequence of not. Do you understand me, Sir Latham?" He did not move. He held the candle. The candle wavered. His face, in the wavering, was the face of a man who had not, in the calculations he had made on the way up the stair, made provision for the sentence she had just spoken. He stepped back. He did not address her further. He turned in the doorway. He went out. He closed her bedroom door behind him. She heard him cross the schoolroom. She heard the key turn in the schoolroom door. She heard the feet on the stair going down. She did not lie back down. She sat against the wall with her hand on the crucifix until the strip of corridor light under the schoolroom door went out at 3, and then she sat in the dark, and at 5 she rose and dressed and waited for the household to wake. She did not let herself think. In the long hours between 1:30 and 5, about the small heat she had registered in the Green Library 3 weeks before. She had been right to register the heat. She had been right to file it. The instrument she had calibrated on the first morning had, in the small hour after Sir Latham's footsteps went down the stair, given her the only weapon she had been able to find in 18 months. She had pointed the weapon at Sir Latham. The weapon had worked. She did not yet know what the weapon was going to ask of her in return. The Duke did not know. The morning after Sir Latham locked her in the schoolroom, that anything had happened. He knew that he had not seen her in 9 days. He knew that Hadley's careful inquiries had returned a set of facts about the Pemberton household which had confirmed everything he had suspected, and added 2 facts that troubled him more than he had expected to be troubled. The first was that Sir Latham had not paid her wages since November. The second was that the household servants, when Hadley had spoken to them, in the small careful way Hadley had of speaking to servants, had been frightened of saying anything at all, and the manner of the fear had been the manner of servants in a house where the master had begun recently to take out his troubles on the staff. He had made his preparations. The man of business had bought the 3 London debts and the Buckinghamshire mortgage. The Duke had paid £11,700 for the lot. The papers sat in the locked drawer of his desk beside the sheet on which he had marked the days. He had not yet decided what to do with them. He had decided that he would not decide until he had spoken to her again. He had been about to write a small careful note to Lady Pemberton, requesting permission to call on the family in the matter of his wife's late cousin, who had been at school with Lady Pemberton's sister 20 years before, when Hadley came into the library and said, "Your Grace." "Yes." "The under-coachman at the Pemberton house has sent word. Miss Marlow has not left the house in 2 days. The schoolroom door is locked from the outside between the hours of 7 in the evening and 7 in the morning. Lady Pemberton's lady's maid, who is the under-coachman's cousin, is of the opinion that the governess is to be dismissed without a reference at the end of the week. The Duke set down his pen. He sat for a moment with his hand on the pen, and then he stood, and he walked to the window, and he looked at the street, and after some seconds he turned back to the room, and he said, "Hadley, Your Grace, you will go to the Pemberton house this afternoon. You will deliver to Sir Latham, in person, a letter from me requesting the honour of his presence at dinner at this house on Friday next. You will say to him that the dinner is to be a small private one in honour of the return from the Crimea of a kinsman of mine. You will indicate that Lady Pemberton is also invited, and that I should be obliged if Miss Petra Pemberton's governess might accompany the family, as my wife's cousin is fond of young children, and Miss Pemberton might be brought down for half an hour after the meal. You will say all of this in a manner that does not admit of refusal. Your Grace, I am aware," the Duke said, "that it is the most transparently invented invitation that has ever been issued in Mayfair. You will issue it anyway, Your Grace, and Hadley, Your Grace. When you have left Sir Latham, you will go to the kitchen entrance of the Pemberton house, and you will speak to Mrs. Calder, who is the housekeeper, and you will give her a sealed note from me to be passed to the governess. The note will be in a sealed cover marked for Miss Marlow's own hand, and the cover will be marked privately. Mrs. Calder has, I am told, served the Pembertons for 9 years, and has not been spoken to with civility in the last 3. You will speak to her with civility. You will give her the note. You will say nothing more. Your Grace." Hadley inclined his head and went out. The Duke sat down at the desk and wrote, in his own hand, on a sheet of his own paper. 6 lines. He read the 6 lines once. He folded the paper. He sealed it. He addressed the cover. He did not write his name on the cover. He gave the sealed cover to Hadley when Hadley returned, and Hadley went out at 3, and the Duke stood at the window of the library until Hadley came back at 5:30, and Hadley said, "It is done, Your Grace," and the Duke nodded and said nothing else for the rest of the afternoon. The note Hester Marlow received at 6 that evening, through the hands of Mrs. Calder, who came up the back stairs with it, pressed inside a folded napkin, contained 6 lines. The 6 lines were these: "Miss Marlow, I have learned this morning that you are not at liberty in your own house. I shall not act on what I have learned without your leave. I shall be at the corner of Wimpole Street and the New Cavendish Road at midnight on Thursday. If you are able to come down, I should be obliged to know that you are well. If you are not able to come down, I shall act in any case, but I should be glad of the knowledge first." She read the note twice. She held it for a moment in both hands. She looked at the locked door of the schoolroom and at the window which faced the street, and she calculated, in the cold, small way she had learned to calculate, that she could be at the corner of Wimpole Street and the New Cavendish Road at midnight on Thursday, because Mrs. Calder had a key to the schoolroom, and because the back stairs would be empty between 11:30 and 1:30, and because Sir Latham slept on the first floor with his door closed. She burned the note in the schoolroom grate. She watched it burn down to nothing, and she stirred the ash with the poker until the paper had gone. And then she sat down at the desk by the window, and she waited for Thursday. Now I want to pause here, because the legal position of a married woman in 1854 England is going to matter in this story, and the legal position of an unmarried governess inside a household even more so. A married woman, under the doctrine of coverture, had no separate legal existence from her husband. She could not hold property in her own name, could not enter into contracts without his consent, could not be sued or sue, and could not refuse the conjugal authority of the man she had married. She had, in the eyes of the law, no person of her own. An unmarried woman in service was free in the technical sense. She was not married to her employer. She was, however, contractually bound to him in a relationship in which he held every meaningful card. He paid her wages or did not pay them. He provided the reference or did not provide it. He locked the schoolroom door or did not lock it. The law did not require him to feed her, to permit her correspondence, to allow her to leave the house in her hours of leisure, or to refrain from any unpleasantness he chose to inflict that did not constitute the formal definition of assault. The law would, in fact, in 1854, have struggled to identify what Sir Latham was doing to Hester Marlow as a wrong at all. This is the world in which the Duke of Stormhaven had decided to involve himself. This is the world he had spent 4 days in his library, reading the rules of. Before he had written his 6 lines on a sheet of his own paper, he knew when he wrote them what he was committing himself to. He wrote them anyway. She came down at 5 minutes to midnight on Thursday. Mrs. Calder unlocked the schoolroom door at 11:30 and did not speak, and Hester went down the back stairs with her shoes in her hand and her cloak over her arm, and she let herself out at the kitchen door, and she walked the long way around the square to the corner of the new Cavendish Road, because she did not want to be seen leaving the house. The night was cold, and the street lamps were lit, and the corner of Wimpole Street and the new Cavendish Road, when she came to it, was empty except for a carriage drawn up at the curb, without a coat of arms on the door, and the Duke standing beside the carriage in a dark coat and a dark hat, and Hadley a respectful distance behind him on the pavement. The Duke turned his head when he heard her step. He took off his hat. "Miss Marlow, Your Grace." She did not approach. She stood at the corner of the railing, perhaps 4 yards from him. "I shall not keep you," he said. "Are you in any immediate danger?" She thought about this. She thought about Sir Latham's face in the library. She thought about the locked door. She thought about Mrs. Calder unlocking it at 11:30 and the cold of the back stairs and her hand on the railing. "I do not know," she said. "I do not believe so. But the door is locked. It is locked. And you have not been paid. Not since November. 5 months. 5 months. He nodded once. He did not move. He said after a moment, "I have made certain arrangements which will, if I choose to act on them, make it impossible for Sir Latham to continue in his present manner. I shall not act on them without your leave. If you wish me to leave the matter alone, I shall leave it alone. I came tonight to ask. I came tonight because it occurred to me, halfway through the day, that I had begun to make decisions concerning your life without consulting you, and that I had no right to do so." She did not answer for some seconds. "What arrangements?" she said. "I have bought his debts. All of them, all of them. The 3 London houses and the Buckinghamshire mortgage. I paid £11,700 for the lot. The papers are in the locked drawer of my desk. He owes the money at present to me." "You did this on Tuesday." "I did it on Wednesday of last week, but before he had locked the door. Before he had locked the door." She looked at him. The street lamp behind him put half his face in the dark, and the other half showed the still careful face she had seen in the Green Library, and she thought, with the same small, dispassionate interest she had registered in the library, that she had spent 4 days in a locked room, being looked at by a man who did not have her interest at heart, and that she was standing at midnight on a street corner, being looked at by a man who did, and that the difference between the 2 ways of being looked at was the whole of the difference between 2 lives. "Why?" she said. "I have told you why. I told you in the bookshop. You came into my library and did a thing no one in 11 years has done. I have spent every day since calculating what to do with what I saw. I have decided. I should be obliged, Miss Marlow, if you would permit me to do it." Decided what? To ruin him. She did not move, and if I refuse, then I shall not ruin him. I shall buy you out of his house in another manner. I shall settle a sum on you in trust through a third party, sufficient for any decent living you choose, and I shall not trouble you again. The choice is yours, Miss Marlow. I came tonight to put it in your hand." She did not answer immediately. She thought, in the cold of the street, and the small yellow circle of the lamp about Petra. She thought about Walter, who would come back from school in 3 weeks and find her gone, and no one to teach his Greek. She thought about Mrs. Calder, who had unlocked the door without speaking, and would be turned out without a reference if it were ever known that she had unlocked it. She thought about Sir Latham, who had stood in his library and said, "I shall require you to swear it." She thought about her aunt's small house in the country town. She thought about the years she had spent learning to take up no space. She thought, "Ruin him," she said. The Duke did not answer. She stepped 1 pace closer to him. She did not curtsy. She had not curtsied in his library, and she would not curtsy now. "I should like," she said, "to be in the room when you do it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Marlow," he said, "you will be in the room." He did not smile. He did not move. Hadley behind him did not move. The street did not move. After what felt like a long time, she inclined her head, the small inclination, and he inclined his. And she turned round around and walked back the way she had come, and into the kitchen door, and up the back stairs, and into the... And Mrs. Calder locked the door behind her at 20 minutes past midnight, and Hester sat on the edge of the small bed in the small room next to the schoolroom, and she did not sleep until 4. She slept then for 2 hours, and at 6 she rose, and at 7 she dressed. And at 7:30, Mrs. Calder brought up the tray with the tea, and at 8 Petra came in, and the day began. She did not know what the Duke had done. She did not know when he would do it. She had decided, at the schoolroom desk in the small hour before dawn, that she would not ask, and that she would teach Petra her sums, and her French and her Bible verses, as she had taught her every morning for 18 months, and that, when the thing happened, she would know it. The thing happened on the Monday. A man called at the house at 10:30 with a letter for Sir Latham. Sir Latham received the letter in the library. He did not come out of the library until 2:30. When he came out, he came up the stairs to the schoolroom, in his own person, without sending Mrs. Calder or the footman, and he opened the door without knocking, and he stood in the door for some seconds before he spoke. His face was the face she had seen the week before, the emptied face, but it was no longer empty. Something had come into it that had not been in it before, and she registered the something, and she did not move, because she had decided 2 nights before that the next time Sir Latham Pemberton came into a room she was in, she would not move. "Miss Marlow," he said. "Sir Latham." He did not come in. He stood in the door. "I am informed," he said, "that the Duke of Stormhaven has, in the past 10 days, purchased my private debts in full. I am informed that he has, this morning, called in the entirety of the sum. I am informed that he proposes to do so at White's this evening at the dinner hour, in the presence of every gentleman of my acquaintance. I am informed that the matter has been spoken of since 11 o'clock in every drawing-room of consequence between Hanover Square and St. James's. I am informed, Miss Marlow, that the Duke has issued a public invitation, which you in particular are required to accept, He stopped. "I should be obliged," he said, "if you would explain to me what you have done." She did not move from the desk. "I have done nothing, Sir Latham." "You have done nothing." "I have returned a purse to its owner." He looked at her for a long moment. The thing that had come into his face moved a fraction. He stepped back from the door. He stood in the corridor outside the schoolroom, and he looked at her across the threshold, and he did not, in that moment, look like the man who had stood behind the desk in his library 9 days before. He looked like a man who had been counted to 0 by a person he had not noticed counting. "You may go down," he said very quietly. "You may take your boxes. There is a carriage at the door." "Whose carriage?" "His." She rose from the desk. She did not pack. She had nothing to pack. She owned the grey gown she stood in, and 1 nightdress and a 2nd set of undergarments, and her aunt's New Testament, 3 books. She had bought herself in 2 years on the small sums she had managed to keep back from her wages, and these were already in the wooden box at the foot of her bed. The box weighed, with everything in it, 9 pounds. She lifted it. She walked past Sir Latham in the doorway, and he did not move out of her way, and she went past him with the box at her hip, and did not turn her head. She walked down the 3 flights with the box at her hip. She did not stop at the schoolroom door. She did not look in to take a last look. She had decided, on the way down the 1st flight, that the schoolroom was not hers, and never had been, and that she would not give Sir Latham the satisfaction of the look. She passed Lady Pemberton on the landing of the 1st floor. Lady Pemberton did not speak to her. Lady Pemberton's face, when she came level with her, was the face of a woman who had been weeping, and Hester did not know whether the weeping was for the husband, or for the household, or for some smaller private cause, and she walked past her without speaking. At the foot of the stairs, Mrs. Calder was waiting in the hall. She did not speak. She took the wooden box from Hester's hand. She walked to the front door. She opened it. The carriage was at the curb. Hadley stood by the open door of the carriage. There was no coat of arms on the door. There had not been a coat of arms on the door at midnight on Thursday. Hester turned in the doorway. Petra was on the stairs. Petra was at the half-landing, in her morning pinafore, with her hand on the banister, and she was looking at Hester. She did not speak. She did not move. She was 7 years old, and the household had not yet taught her not to cry in public, and she did not cry. She stood at the banister, and she looked at Hester, and Hester looked at Petra, and, for a moment, that she would not forget, she registered, in the careful inventory, of small private things she would carry with her out of the house, that the child knew exactly what was happening, and would not give any of them the satisfaction of pretending otherwise. "Petra," Hester said. "Miss Marlow. You will read your French verbs." "I shall, Miss Marlow. I shall be in London. I shall write to you." "Mrs. Calder will read the letters." "Yes, Miss Marlow." She did not climb the stairs to the child. She did not embrace her. She had learned what embraces did. She inclined her head, very small, in the way she had inclined her head in the library, and Petra inclined her head, the same gesture. The child's perfect imitation of the woman who had taught her every gesture she knew, and Hester turned out of the door, and she stepped into the carriage, and Hadley closed the door behind her. The carriage moved off down Wimpole Street. She did not look back. The Duke met her in the small drawing-room of the house in Mayfair at 4 o'clock. She had been put, on her arrival, into a room she had not seen before. It was a small room on the ground floor, papered in pale grey, with 2 chairs and a low table and a fire and a window that looked into the small severe garden through which she had walked the first morning. Mrs. Calder had not come with her. Mrs. Calder, she had been told by Hadley on the way, would remain at the Pemberton house until the household was disposed of, which would not be long. The Duke had made certain arrangements for Mrs. Calder, which she would learn of in due course. She had been given tea. She had not drunk it. She had stood at the window of the small, grey room, with her hands folded in front of her, and she had waited, and at 4 o'clock the door had opened, and the Duke had come in. He closed the door behind him. He did not approach the window. He stood by the door. He said, "Miss Marlow, Your Grace, I have a great deal to say to you. I have decided to say very little of it now. I shall say 2 things. I should like, when I have said them, to know what you wish to do next. Yes. The first thing is this. I have, in the past fortnight, taken actions on your behalf which I had no right to take without your permission, and which I took anyway. I have bought a man's debts. I have ruined a man at his club. I have removed a woman from a house in which she was paying for her board with her labour and not being paid for either. I had reasons for taking these actions. The reasons satisfied me. They were not, however, the reasons of a man who had asked. I have not, Miss Marlow asked. I am asking now." "Asking what, Your Grace? Whether you wish me to continue?" She looked at him. "Continue," she said. "I have, as I told you on Thursday night, kept account of the days since you came into this house with the purse in your hand. I kept the count in my own writing in the locked drawer of my desk every morning since. I have done so because I have been waiting until I could speak to you with the count in my hand and ask you a question. I have been waiting because I could not in conscience ask the question while you were in a house where the answer was not free. You are out of the house. I am asking the question, Miss Marlow. The question is this: will you marry me?" She did not move. She did not answer. The fire ticked in the grate. She heard it. She heard Hadley's foot on the boards in the corridor beyond the door, and then heard it move away. She heard, very distantly, the clock on the mantel in the next room strike the 1/4 hour. "Why?" she said. "I have given you no proper answer to that question." "I had not this morning given myself one. I shall try." "I do not promise the answer will be a good one." "Try." I had spent 11 years before you came into my library being looked at by women who wanted things from me. I had given some of them what they wanted, and I had refused the rest, and I had built, around the 11 years, a small careful house in which I was never asked for anything I had not already decided to give. The house had been a comfortable one. It had also been a small one. You came into my library and asked for nothing. You held out a purse that contained more money than you would earn in a lifetime, and you refused 20 sovereigns for the trouble of returning it. You did not curtsy. You did not look away. You answered the questions I asked you, and you did not answer the questions I did not. You walked out of my house in mud, on the hem of a gown that had been turned twice, and a cuff that had been let down once, and I stood at the window of the library for the rest of the night, and I understood, in the 3rd hour, that I had spent 11 years building a house I no longer wished to live in. You have been the only person in my life, Miss Marlow, who has wanted from me a thing I cannot give. I have spent the days since trying to discover whether there is something I can give you that you might, by some chance, want. He stopped. "That is the answer," he said. "It is not a good one. It is the one I have." She looked at him. She said, "After a long time, I should like to sit down, Your Grace." He moved at once. He drew the chair from the table. He set it for her. He did not sit himself. She sat. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at them for some seconds. "I have not been asked to marry by anyone before," she said. "I do not know what is customary. There is nothing customary about it. No, I do not require an answer this afternoon. I require only that you remain in this house in any capacity you wish, on any terms you set, until you have made up your mind. I shall not press you. I shall not appear at your door. I shall send Hadley once a day at 4 to ask if there is anything you require. I shall give you the run of every room in the house in which I am not, except the library which is mine, and which I should be glad to share with you when you wish. I shall not write to you. I shall not look at you. Across room Sir Latham looked at you in his. I shall wait, Miss Marlow, until you tell me what you wish to do. I shall wait, if necessary, the rest of my life. I have, as a matter of fact, been waiting the better part of one already. She did not look up from her hands. And the dinner at White's tonight. I had not intended that you should be at White's tonight. White's is no place for a woman. I shall be at White's at the dinner hour. Sir Latham will be there. The matter of the debts will be concluded in the presence of every man who has held a card he was not in a position to play. You will not be present. You will be in this house. You will, if it pleases you, dine in any room you choose. There will be no obligation. There will be no observation. There will be, this evening, only the small fact of a house in London in which you may, for the first time in some years, be a private person. She raised her face. I gave you my answer at the corner of Wimpole Street and the New Cavendish Road on Thursday, she said. I said I should like to be in the room. I should like to be in the room, Your Grace. He did not answer for some seconds. White's does not admit women. Then admit me in another manner. He looked at her. The still careful face she had seen in the library, and in the park, and in the bookshop, and at the corner of the street, moved a fraction. Something in it changed. The change was not a smile. Although it stood in the place, a smile would have stood. Miss Marlow, he said, you will be in the room. I want to pause one more time, because we are about to come to the centerpiece of this story, and I want to be sure you understand the machinery of what the Duke is about to do. A gentleman's club in London in 1854 was the engine room of every reputation in the country. It was the place men came to be seen. It was the place at which loans were extended, sons placed, daughters discussed, and the smallest defaults in honour, in money, or in conduct were quietly recorded and recirculated. To be cut at one's club was to be cut by society. To be exposed at one's club was to be exposed in every drawing-room a man's wife visited, and every house in the country a man's son might one day be received in. White's was the oldest of these clubs and the most particular. To be ruined at White's in the public dinner hour, in the presence of every man of consequence in the city, was to be ruined in a manner from which there was no recovery. A duke could, in 1854, ruin a baronet at White's. A duke could not, by the rules of the club, bring a woman into the dining-room. A duke could, however, arrange for a small private dining parlour adjacent to the main room, the kind that had been used for 30 years for the conduct of confidential business, and a duke could arrange for the door of the parlour to be opened at the precise moment the matter became public, and the woman in the parlour could, in this way, be present without being present, could witness without being witnessed, could see and be unseen. This is what the Duke of Stormhaven had arranged for Hester Marlow. This is what she walked into at 8:30 on the evening of the 11th of April, 1854. She did not wear the grey gown. The Duke's housekeeper, who had been informed of the matter at 5, had produced from a press in the upper rooms a black silk gown that belonged to the Duke's mother, who had been a small woman, and which had been altered with the speed only a great household could command. The housekeeper had also produced a black bonnet and a black cloak, and had said, quietly and without explanation, that black was the appropriate colour for a witness, which Hester had not understood and had not asked about. She had been driven to St. James's in a carriage without arms on the door. She had been brought in at a side entrance by an attendant who had not been told who she was. She had been seated, alone, in the small private parlour at the back of the main dining room. The parlour had 2 chairs and a table and a single lamp. The door connecting it to the main dining room was closed. She heard through the door the sound of the room. It was a particular sound. Men's voices, low and unhurried, the small ring of plate, the longer ring of crystal, a laugh somewhere that did not quite finish. The voices of a great many men whose lives had been arranged so that they did not have to raise them. She heard one voice rise above the rest. It was the Duke. She could not hear the words. She could hear the manner of them. The voice was the voice she had heard in the Green Library, the voice that paid the cost of speaking by meaning what it said. And it was speaking now in the manner of a man, laying out, very quietly, a matter that the room was required to hear. There was a silence. Then a second voice spoke. It was Sir Latham's. She knew the voice. She did not have to hear the words. She knew the small, careful pleasantness of it, and she knew the moment in the voice when the pleasantness gave out. The Duke spoke again. She heard through the door the rustle of paper. She heard the Duke's voice say a number. She heard the small involuntary noise of a room of men who had not, until that moment, known the number. She heard a chair move. She heard the Duke's voice say a sentence she could not make out the words of. The sentence was short. The sentence ended. The door of the small parlour opened. The Duke stood in the door. He was in evening dress. His face was a still, careful face. He did not come into the parlour. He held the door open. He inclined his head. "Miss Marlow," he said, "if you will." She rose. She walked across the parlour. She came to the door. She did not stop. She walked through the door and into the dining room of White's, and the dining room of White's saw her. There were perhaps 40 men in the room. They had all turned. They had turned because they had been required to turn, because the Duke had paused in the matter of Sir Latham Pemberton's debts and Latham Pemberton's conduct in his own household, to open a small door at the back of the room, and through the door had come a woman. She stood beside the Duke. She did not curtsy. She did not look at Sir Latham. She did not need to look at Sir Latham. She had not come to look at Sir Latham. She had come to be seen by every man in the room who had heard the Duke speak, and she stood beside the Duke, and she let them see her, and she let them see that the woman the Duke had spoken of was a woman of perhaps 22, in a borrowed black gown that did not fit her at the shoulders, with her hands at her sides, and her face composed in the small, careful blankness of a governess in a position, and that this was the woman over whom the matter of Sir Latham Pemberton's life had just been concluded. The Duke did not introduce her. He did not need to. He turned his head a fraction. He looked at Sir Latham. Sir Latham was on his feet. The chair behind him had been pushed back. His face was the white of a man who had understood, perhaps a half-second before everyone else in the room, what was happening. The Duke spoke. He spoke very quietly. He spoke so that the room could hear, without any of them having to admit that they were listening. "You have known this woman," the Duke said, "for 18 months. You have employed her in your house. You have not paid her wages since November. You have locked the door of the room in which she sleeps. You have threatened her with dismissal without reference at every occasion on which she has displeased you. I am informed you have done these things in the careful, pleasant manner you have made a habit of, and that you have done them because the law permits you to, and because you have calculated that the woman has no recourse. He paused. "The woman," he said, "has recourse. The recourse is standing beside me. I should be obliged, Sir Latham, if you would address her by the name to which she is entitled, in the presence of these gentlemen, who will require it for the records they keep among themselves." Sir Latham did not speak. The Duke waited. He waited the long, careful pause of a man who had spent 10 days in a library deciding the precise measure of the public consequence he intended to inflict, and who had, in deciding it, decided he would not be hurried in the inflicting. "Sir Latham," he said. Sir Latham opened his mouth. He did not speak. "Address her," the Duke said, "as Her Grace, the Duchess of Stormhaven." The room did not move. Hester did not move. She had not been told that she was the Duchess of Stormhaven. She had not been asked. She had not given her answer to the question the Duke had put to her in the small grey drawing-room at 4 o'clock that afternoon. The Duke had said he would wait the rest of his life. The Duke had been waiting 4.5 hours. The Duke had decided, in the 4.5 hours, that he would say, in the dining-room of White's a Thing, she had not yet given him leave to say, and that he would say it because saying it was the surest way to make Sir Latham Pemberton say it after him. She did not look at the Duke. She did not need to. Sir Latham looked at her. His mouth moved. The pleasantness did not come back to his face. He said, in a voice that was not quite the voice she had heard in the library on Wimpole Street, "Your Grace." "You will repeat it," the Duke said. "You will repeat it in full, in the form I have required." Sir Latham closed his eyes. He opened them. "Her Grace," he said, "the Duchess of Stormhaven." The room exhaled. The Duke inclined his head. "You are forgiven your debts to me, Sir Latham. You will leave this room. You will leave London by tomorrow night. You will not return. The papers concerning your debts will remain in my keeping. You will receive, through my man of business, a quarterly statement of the interest accruing on them, which you will pay from such income as your Buckinghamshire estate is able to generate. If you fail to pay it, I shall foreclose, and you will lose the Buckinghamshire estate also. If at any time it comes to my attention that you have spoken of this matter in any manner, or that you have set foot in any house in which my wife is also be a guest, or that you have addressed her in any communication of any kind whatever, I shall foreclose without warning. Do I make myself plain, Your Grace?" "Plain." "Yes, Your Grace, you may go." Sir Latham did not move for a moment, then he turned. He walked the length of the dining-room to the door at the front. He did not look at any of the men he passed. The men did not look at him. He went out at the door. The door closed. The Duke turned to Hester. He did not speak. He inclined his head. The inclination was the deep, formal inclination of a duke acknowledging his duchess in a public room, and it was the first time in her life Hester Marlow had received such a gesture. She did not answer it with a curtsy. She had not curtsied in his library, and she had not curtsied at his door, and she would not curtsy here. She inclined her head in return, the small inclination, and the Duke offered her his arm. She put her hand on his arm. He covered her hand with his own. He did not look at the room when he did it. He did not require the room to see him do it. The room saw it anyway. The hand he placed over hers was bare, and it was warm, and it stayed where he had put it. And he walked her the length of the dining-room, and out at the door, past 40 men of consequence in the city, with his hand over hers, the entire length of the walk, and not one of them spoke until the door had closed behind her, and not one of them, in the years that followed, ever spoke of any other moment of the evening with as much attention as they spoke of his bare hand on her gloved one. Across the length of that room, she did not speak in the carriage back to the house. She did not speak when the carriage stopped at the door. or when Hadley handed her down, or when the housekeeper took her cloak. She walked into the small grey drawing room. She stood at the window. She kept her hands folded in front of her. The Duke followed her into the room. He closed the door. He did not approach the window. He stood by the door. "Miss Marlow." "I am not Miss Marlow." "No, you did not ask. I did not ask." "You said you would wait the rest of your life." "I lied." I had not anticipated, when I said it, that Sir Latham would be in the chair at the head of his table in 20 minutes. I had not anticipated that I should be required in the presence of the room to say what I said in order to him say what I made him say. I had thought that I could carry the matter on the strength of the debts alone. I was wrong. I miscalculated. The miscalculation was mine. I shall apologize to you in any form you require, and I shall, if you will hear me, give you the room of the house and the keeping of the door. And you may stand on the steps of this house tomorrow morning and tell the City of London that you are not the Duchess of Stormhaven. And I shall not contradict you. I shall accept whatever shape of consequence you choose to set. She did not turn from the window. "You said," she said, "that you had spent 11 years building a house you no longer wished to live in." "I said it. What house do you wish to live in?" He did not answer immediately. "I do not know," he said. "I have not yet imagined it. I had hoped in the past 3 weeks that I might be permitted to imagine it with the assistance of the only person who has ever asked me what house I wish to live in." She turned around. He was standing by the door. He had not moved. He had taken off his hat. His face was the still careful face, and the something that had not been a smile in the small grey drawing room at 4 o'clock had come back into it, and was standing in the place a smile would have stood. And she looked at him and at the small thing in his face, and she did not move for some seconds. "I should require terms," she said. "You shall have them. I shall not be looked at. I shall not be shown. I shall not be paraded. I shall not be required to take part in any matter of society for which I have not been prepared. You shall not. I shall require Mrs. Calder to be brought to this house and given a place in it, with such wages as you and she agree, for as long as she pleases. It is done. It was done this morning. I shall require Petra Pemberton to be permitted to write to me and to receive my letters and to come to this house on the days her mother is willing to send her. It is done. I shall require," she said, and her voice did not move, "that you do not ever, in any room of this house or any house of yours, address me in the careful, pleasant voice with which Sir Latham Pemberton addressed me. I shall hear that voice from no one again. I shall not hear it from you." He did not move. "Miss Marlow," he said, "you have my word." She looked at him. "And the sergeant," she said, "in Bermondsey, the man you were carrying the 500 sovereigns to, has he been paid?" The Duke did not answer for a moment. "He has not," he said. "I have not been to Bermondsey in 3 weeks. I have been otherwise occupied." "You will go tomorrow." "I shall. You will take me with you, Miss Marlow." "I shall like to meet the man whose purse I returned. I shall like to know whose obligation I have spent 3 weeks honouring instead of him. I shall require it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You shall meet him," he said. "I had not thought you would ask. I shall be glad to take you to Bermondsey tomorrow. I shall be glad of every place you ask me to take you." She looked at her hands. She unfolded them. She looked back at him. "You may sit down," she said. "You've been standing by that door for half an hour. You have been standing by various doors of various rooms for 3 weeks. I should like, if I may, to be in a room with you in which neither of us is standing by a door." He drew the chair from the table. He set it for her. He sat in the chair opposite. The fire ticked. She did not, that night, give him the answer to the question he had put to her in the small grey room at 4 o'clock. She did not need to. The answer had been given in another form in the dining room of White's when she had walked through the door he had opened, and she had not corrected him in the silence. After Sir Latham had said the words, and she had taken his arm and walked the length of the room, she gave him the answer in words, in the small grey drawing-room, at 20 minutes past midnight, in the same quiet voice she had used in the Green Library 3 weeks before. He said her name. He said it the way he had said it the first time, in the Green Library, with his mouth, without comment, as though he were testing the sound of it in a room. He said it again. He said it differently the second time. She did not, afterwards, remember what he had said when he had said it differently. She remembered only the way the word had landed in the room, and the fact that the room had held it. He rose from the chair. She rose from hers. He did not. In the small grey drawing-room at 20 minutes past midnight, close the last of the distance between them. He stepped to within the breadth of a hand of her face. He did not raise his own hands. He stood in the small warm air between them for a count of seconds she did not measure. And she did not move, and he did not move, and after the count of seconds he said, very quietly, "I shall not kiss you in this room." She did not answer. "I have waited 317 days, he said. "I shall wait 3 weeks more. I shall not be the man who first kisses his Duchess in a house that received her at 4 o'clock, under the obligation of having nowhere else to go. I shall be the man who kisses her in a carriage, outside a church, on a morning she has chosen, in a gown she has chosen, with her name written in a book in her own hand." She raised her face. She said, 3 weeks. 3 weeks. He did not move from the place he had stopped. He stood in the warm air. She felt the warmth of him along the line of her shoulder. She felt the small line of his breath. She did not move closer. She did not move back. She held the warm air between them. For the count of seconds he held it. And then she said, in the same level register she had used at the corner of the new Cavendish Road, "You may go to bed, Your Grace." He inclined his head. He stepped back. The cold of the room came back into the place where the warmth had stood. He went out at the door, and he closed it, and she heard his foot on the corridor, and she stood in the small grey drawing-room for several minutes after he had gone, and she did not, for those minutes, do anything in particular except stand in the place she had been standing, with her hands at her sides, and acknowledge that she had spent 18 months not being warm in any room of any house, and that a man in evening dress had spent 30 seconds standing close enough to her to warm her, and that the warmth had not, when he had stepped back, left her body at the rate it had been entering it. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church of St. James's, Piccadilly, at 9:30 in the morning, in the presence of 7 witnesses. Mrs. Calder was among them. Petra Pemberton was among them. The sergeant from Bermondsey was among them, in a coat the Duke had made for him in a week. The Duke's man of business was among them, with the papers concerning Sir Latham Pemberton's debts in a folder under his arm, which had been carried into the church for the precise reason that the Duke had decided that the marriage of Hester Marlow to the Duke of Stormhaven would be witnessed by the instruments of the conclusion of her former life and no others. Hester wore grey. She had refused the white. She had said, when the housekeeper had brought the white silk and laid it on the bed in the small grey room, that she had been married to her grey gown for 18 months and would not abandon the colour at the door of the church. The housekeeper had not argued. The Duke had not argued. A grey silk gown had been made in the week before the wedding, of a quality The grey gown of her 3 years' service had not aspired to, and Hester had worn it down the aisle on the arm of Mrs. Calder, who had given her away on the instructions of Hester herself, and the consent of the Duke, who had said, when Hester had asked for it, that no other instrument of her former life would suit so well. She did not cry at the altar. She had not cried in the 18 months of the Pemberton house, and she did not begin now. The Duke did not cry either. The Duke said his vows in the voice that paid the cost of speaking, by meaning what it said, and Hester said hers in the level register of a woman who had decided what she meant before she came to the door of the church. The vicar pronounced them married at 5 minutes past 10. The Duke took her hand. He raised it. He did not kiss her in the church. He had said, in the small grey drawing-room 3 weeks before, that he would not be the man who first kissed his duchess in a house she had been received into, under the obligation of having nowhere else to go, and that he would wait until they came out at a church she had chosen, in a gown she had chosen, with her name in the book in her own hand. She had thought in the 3 weeks about the seconds at a hand's breadth of warmth in the small grey room. She had thought about them at breakfast. She had thought about them when she had walked the small severe garden alone. She had thought about them in the long Yorkshire evenings the Duke had taken her up to. In the 2nd week, she had stood at the window of the house at Stormhaven and looked at the moor and thought, with the dispassionate interest she had registered every reading of the instrument with, that the man who had taken her up to Yorkshire and had not crossed any room she was in to come closer than a hand's breadth had spent 3 weeks, calibrating her exactly as carefully as she had spent the same 3 weeks calibrating him, and that the calibration was complete. He kissed her in the carriage on the way back from the church. He kissed her once. He kissed her as a man who had counted 338 days and was not going to count any further. He kissed her in the manner of a man who had decided in the Green Library on the morning he had first counted that he would not give the woman in his library anything she had not asked for, and who had now been asked. He kissed her as though the cost of speaking had finally been paid, and there was nothing left to mean. She did not speak. He did not speak. She had, by the time the carriage reached the door of the house in Mayfair, decided that the small heat she had registered, the first time she had stood Green Library, when his bare hand had passed across the space between them without touching hers, had the first reading of an instrument that had spent the 3 weeks since calibrating itself, and that the instrument had now read. She turned to him in the carriage. She put her hand against the side of his face. She had not touched his face before. She felt the small line of the shave under her palm, and the warmth of him, and the slight stillness of him at her hand. She said, very quietly, "You will kiss me again." He did. He kissed her in the carriage at the curb of his house in Mayfair, in the small grey morning of the 18th of May, in the year 1854, and he did not, that morning, lift his head from hers until Hadley knocked on the door of the carriage to ask whether her Grace would like to be assisted down, and the Duke said, in a voice she had not heard him use before, "Not yet, Hadley. A moment longer. I want to close, because we have come to the end of the part of the story I was going to tell you tonight, although there is, in any honest sense, a great deal of it still to come. Hester Marlow lived to be 83 years old. She bore the Duke 4 children, of whom 3 lived. She did not, in any of the 61 years of her marriage, attend a London season. She did not, in any of those years, hold a drawing-room in town. She held drawing-rooms at Stormhaven, the Yorkshire seat, twice a year, and she invited to those drawing rooms the wives of every man who had been in the dining room of White's on the night of the 11th of April, 1854, and she received them in the long Yorkshire dining room with the windows that opened onto the moor, in such grey gowns as she had made the cut of her household, and she did not speak to them about Sir Latham Pemberton, who lived another 23 years in a small house in Buckinghamshire, and died alone, except to ask of any wife whose husband had been at White's that night, whether her husband had remembered to bring his appetite. Petra Pemberton was raised, after her mother's death 5 years later, in the Duke's household at Stormhaven, and married at 23 a younger son of the Earl of Dunhaven, whom she had met at the Duke's table. Mrs. Calder lived in the household until she died, 22 years later, in her own room. The sergeant from Bermondsey was given an annuity of £70 a year by the Duke, which he refused, and which he was permitted, after a long correspondence, to accept on the grounds that the annuity was held in his late wife's name, and disbursed to him through her family. The Duke and Hester were married, at Hester's instruction, for 61 years. The locked drawer of his desk in the Mayfair house contained, when the Duke died, 3 things: the sheet of paper on which he had marked the days, the first letter Hester had written him after the marriage, which had been a list of the household accounts she intended to manage, and the books she intended to read, and a leather purse, drawn tight at the neck with a leather cord, empty. He had kept the purse. He had kept it because, as he wrote in the codicil of the will that took of it to her, the morning a woman in a grey gown had walked into his library with the purse in her hand had been the morning. He had stopped marking days for any reason other than the woman, and he wished her to have the purse as a reminder, in case she ever forgot, that he had spent every day, since she gave it back, trying to give her something heavier than 500 sovereigns. The codicil concluded, in the dry small phrasing of the Duke's hand, that he had not been certain in any year of the 61 whether he had succeeded, and that he should be obliged if she would, in the time remaining, continue to instruct him. She kept the purse on the desk of her own library at Stormhaven until she died. That is the story. It is one of the ones that, when I had finished writing it, I had to sit with for a while. I think you can tell. The thing in this story that strikes me, the thing I keep coming back to, is the smallness of the decision she made at the foot of the wall. She did not save a life. She did not strike a blow against an injustice. She bent in a street and picked up a leather purse, and she chose, because she had not yet stopped being able to make the choice, to walk it to a gate. The whole of life turned on that small bend. The whole of his did too. I am not certain anything matters more than the fact that he kept the purse. Thank you for being here. If this story moved you, leave me a comment and tell me which moment held you longest. If you are new, subscribe and stay. There is another story coming, and I have already begun marking the days. I shall see you in the next one.